Hi, everybody. Welcome to Drawing X Live with me, Jedidiah Dore. I'm an instructor here at Drawing Expressions. I can't wait to show you today's class. I've been really excited about this because we're going to get into gouache painting. And gouache painting is something that I really love to work on, and just been feeling like I haven't had enough time really to really develop it and really work on it. But I've learned a few things here and there, and I want to share them with you today. So today's class is Be Warm, Be Cool, and we're going to work with the landscape painting in gouache. I'm going to take you to an introduction, sort of effortless process to painting your next landscape masterpiece, hopefully using gouache paints. All right, so let's get right to it because we got some painting to do, right? Let's show you my desktop first. Let's see here. Just switch over to my camera. There we go. And it's my handy dandy desktop. I have this watercolor paper. It's pretty thick. It's about a 300 GSM paper. It's nice and textured too. You can use a Bristol board or an illustration board, anything that's heavy that can give you a lot of can take on a lot of water and a lot of watercolor or gouache wet medium. I also have a variety of brushes. I don't think I'm going to use all of these brushes. I just kind of put them aside here just to make sure that we have the right brushes. But let me show you some of the variety. Aside from that, a couple of colored pencils just to case in the sketch before we start painting. We can do that as well. Just a variety of brushes, of flat brushes and round brushes, mostly flat brushes. I like working with angled or flat brushes. Some smaller brushes for detail, and a nice sort of quarter-inch round brush for all the stuff in between, and a few different sizes of flat brushes. I have a nice big one for coverage, and then a medium one, and then maybe a smaller one. So I won't use all of these, but we'll see what comes in handy for our landscape. The thing with brushes is the less is better. It's almost good practice to try to do painting with just a single brush. It's a good way to practice your marks and to concentrate more on values and composition. That way, it doesn't feel too complicated and too much at one time. All right, so let's put these aside, and I also want to show you some of the colors that I went ahead and put on my palette paper. Right now, if you have a little sort of palette, plastic palette, or artist palette, that works just as well. But this is palette paper. It's nice and handy, and I put some of the colors on here that I think we're going to be using. And basically just some primary colors and some secondary colors that we'll be mixing. I'll show you how to do that. Don't worry about that. All right. First things first, let's get right to it. All right. So with gouache, it's really, really great medium because it's so easy to use. It's almost I like to think of it as sort of a cross between acrylic and watercolor, although it just, it's so much more opaque. I would say it, and at times it can be even more opaque than acrylic because it's just, it has that really vibrant color that, in this case, with acrylic and watercolor, we tend to work from light to dark to layer those colors. But with gouache, it's so opaque we can work from dark to light, and that's what we're going to be doing today, right? So we're going to start with a sketch and then some painting the base layers first, and I'll explain what that is along the way. We're going to work from dark to light, so dark color values at first. And that's the great thing about gouache, like I said, is the light colors can be added right on top, and it'll sit right on top of that other color, the previous colors. Wait for the layers to dry, and then watch for any kind of color shifting and make those adjustments. And then last but not least, the highlights. I know we're talking about going from dark to light. The highlights I like to add last. So any very bright white highlights or any kind of spot highlights you want to add, it's great to add those last in your painting. That's how opaque gouache is, how forgiving it is really. So let's put this palette aside here. I'm just going to put it off to the side, just right off our camera here. And we're going to start with just a nice, simple sketch to just outline our drawing, right? And just start with a light pencil if you want. This one is a different Pro Color Blue Violet Lake. It's actually fitting for what we're going to be drawing. This Scandinavian harbor, this really nice, beautiful landscape. So let's just start off with maybe just casing in where we want the composition to be. Perhaps maybe start up the top here where the mountains are going to be and just kind of block it in from there, right? So I'm going to start off on the left side and just draw in that mountain that we see there. And just start off with a contour line drawing. That's just the outside edge of the subject that you see. And it's okay if you don't see the horizon, just kind of fill in the blanks where you think it kind of begins and ends, right? You can kind of taper it off to the side like that. And that's the great thing about it, like with gouache, is that it's so very opaque. It doesn't matter if we have these pencil lines in there, you can definitely paint over them. And then some of the background here that we see, kind of come in a little bit closer so we can see some of the detail in there. Just like that. And there's some nice mountains kind of peeking from behind off in the distance. That's going to make for pretty dramatic composition for us, right? That looks pretty good. And then the left side here, there's one mountain just kind of peeking off, greeting us on the left side of the composition. We can kind of taper that off if you want to just imagine how that looks. That's looking pretty good, right? And now really the biggest subject, biggest contour line that I'm seeing is just the front of the cliffs here, the sea cliffs just facing the water. And that just kind of wraps around, kind of in a semicircle, really. So it starts off right here and then just points out a little bit, about 2/3 of the page, and then just kind of cuts in here and there, just like that. Okay, very good. And we can include this rock right in the foreground here if we want. We'll see if we get there. It's okay if you don't get to the entire composition and get to paint the entire composition in today's session, because you can certainly revisit it. And that's a great thing. Another great thing about gouache is that you can reactivate the colors, the paint. It's so easy to reactivate them again with water. All right. And if we want, now with this stage here, you don't have to go fully detailed with a full detailed drawing. It's just really just, you're just sketching out the overall composition in the drawing. So you want to draw some major subject matter, some of the bigger areas of color that we're going to be painting first, some of our base layer colors. But if you want, just for reference, you can draw in a little bit of the subject matter. For example, let's draw some of the houses here and some of the property right that wraps around the top of this area. And there's a little sort of hill right here that kind of anchors it like that. You can add a few of the houses here just so you know for reference approximately where we are in the composition. That's something I might do. That's a good idea. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's add just a few of the houses in there. You don't have to include all of them because you can just paint right over it. Maybe let's do these houses, these beautiful red houses right in the front here. I think that's a good idea. And a nice shape to them. Just like that. Great. And then this one's kind of looking off into the distance. Almost looks like it's looking off the edge of the rocks. All right. So right there, we have a really good composition now. We have a good idea where everything's kind of got to go in this composition, and we can start to paint some of those base layers first and working from darkest to light. All right. So I'm talking about, today we're going to talk about warm colors and cool colors. Really, the most basic way, good way to think about it is that cool colors recede, right? So we're looking at those mountains in the background. I grab a couple of brushes here, and we're going to be using some cool colors, right, for those mountains in the background so that they look further back. That's the way our eye kind of sees colors. And warmer colors advance. And that's something that we're going to be applying today. It's really simple. So we're going to be using some warm colors for some of the foreground subjects and lots of cool colors. Both cool as in awesome and cool as in cooler temperature colors for the background. All right, so let's do that first. Start. I like to work from top down, so that way I'm not touching or smearing any of the areas that I'm painting. So I'm kind of selecting some different brushes here that I think would be good for this area. Maybe these square brushes might be good for the mountain for now. Not too many brushes, right? Let's keep it simple. Let's start off with this nice, looks like almost a half-inch brush here. And we're going to block in some larger areas of color before we move on to the finer details. So that's what we're doing here with working with the base layers. And that's why that's important to start there. And think about some cool colors that you like, right? Some blues, violets, maybe some magentas, or anything that you think would work great to describe, to paint this the background areas where the mountains are. Right. So I'm going to start with just a nice light blue, almost a sky blue. It's a nice dark cloudy day. It's very dramatic, right? And I got my water here in this reference. What I'm going to do is, instead of painting the sky blue, because that's going to be kind of gray if you want to paint that gray, I'm just going to create a little bit of a light blue with some white and add it to this nice light blue here. So just a little bit of white goes a long way. And I love to paint my own colors. I don't like to use it right straight from the tube. So that's a nice color there. And it's a little bit warm, so I want to add just a little bit of ultramarine here, just a tad to kind of cool it down a little bit. And just a little bit more white on there. That's better, right? Yeah, it's nice and cool. Very dramatic. All right. Now, so let's put this off here. This there is good. And let's use this color here. Now this brush might be a little bit too big for what we're painting, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and go for it, right? So let's add some of this blue here. And you can go a little bit over, that's okay. Because remember, you'll see, I'll show you, kind of going over some of the edges to show you how opaque it really is, right? So I'm going to paint the furthest mountains in the background, this nice light blue. Just kind of trails off into the distance, right? Just like that. Just a few touches here and there, just to get the overall shape in there. There we go. Okay, so that's a nice, beautiful blue there. You can see how nice and cool it is. And now, just to kind of vary the color a little bit, I'm gonna put this brush down here, just on my palette here. And I'm gonna mix kind of the similar blue, but I'm gonna add a little bit more color to it. A little bit more white. And all I'm really doing is I'm just mixing a different tone of blue just slightly. See the difference between the two? Yeah, one has a little bit more purple in it, a little bit more red in it, right? And let's add a little bit of white to that and keep it nice and subtle. If you add a little bit too much like I did there, it's no big deal. You can kind of go back and just mix it a little bit more. There we go. So that's a nice pairing of two tones. It's similar cool colors there. We're going to use that. All right. I'll put this brush aside here and let's paint this mountain in the distance with this other version of blue that we just mixed. And if you have some pretty thick watercolor paper, the gouache will make quick work of it because it's so opaque, and you can experiment with how much water you want to use because you can sort of use the gouache um, similar to how you would use watercolors, a little bit more of a wash. You can thin them out, but I think that takes away from how gloriously vibrant they are and how incredibly dynamic the colors can look. That's the great advantage to using gouache. I'm just gonna start painting in the direction, creating some patterns with my brush strokes to make it really interesting. Right? If I want a little bit more opacity in my painting, I'm gonna just use a little bit less water and just have more pigment on the brush rather than water. This is watercolor. Of course, we're creating glazes. We're creating some transparent washes with that. See how nice and opaque that is? It's a beautiful color too. It's just slightly more purple, a little bit more blue in this tone that we mixed. Right, so we're creating some base layers here. Just setting up some of the big areas. We created this outline of the section of the composition of the entire drawing, the entire painting, and now we're just filling in some of the big areas of color. All right. And this is just really just the first coat. We're just kind of working on just coverage for now. Just find the largest areas of color that you see. This is going to help you really block in composition. Well, they're great. So now we have these colors already handy. We can kind of shift the colors a little bit more. I still have this big thick brush. I think it'd be great to use it for this mountain here. But I'm just cleaning up the brush that I already have that I just used for the mountain on the left. Okay, and just getting rid of most of the water. I have this rag here off to the side. And I'm just going to mix a little bit. Now for this one here, I'm going to make this one a little bit darker. I'm imagining, even though it's a cloudy day, it looks like the sun is kind of hitting from the left side, maybe at our 9 or 10 o'clock position downward at an angle. So this might be in shadow. So I'm going to create this still in this area of color, but also a cool color, but just slightly darker, right? So maybe just add a little bit darker color here and just a touch of another cool color, maybe a purple would be great. Let's see how that looks. And this is a great way to really learn about color mixing. You're just kind of experimenting with primaries and secondaries and see how things go from there. There we go. It's a little bit wet. I want a little bit more pigment on there. Okay. And that's looking pretty good. I do want to tone it down a little bit So maybe some sienna, just a little bit, right? And if it gets dark on you like that, all you got to do is just add some pure color. Don't add white, because what that's going to do is it's going to thin out. It's going to make the color less impactful, less vibrant, right? So that's closer to what I was imagining. And almost a dark blue or a dark, very dark, dusty kind of dusty mauve or dusty teal color. That's looking good. It's still in the same family, and that's what's important is it's all very cohesive, right? And you see how I went over the line here with that previous color of blue? Watch what happens because it's so opaque. You can just go right over it and it's no big deal, just like that, right? That's what's great about gouache. And we can just case in the rest of it here, right? Just one brush, no big deal, right? So easy. No complexity. You're just fun painting, almost like when we were kids and we just painting for play and just experimenting with it, right? So already you could see how the cool color in the background is pushed back behind it. This is slightly warmer and it just works that way to trick the eye, making it feel like it's off in the distance, right? That's a great color. And the other thing to do is to consider is to bring some of these colors, some of this local color down into this area here. So don't be afraid to kind of use some of that color down at the bottom and really make it more cohesive, right? So now the mountain here, I'm going to make this probably more of a pure color of purple because it's still in the same family. We were adding touches of purple. So I think it's good to separate these mountains to kind of make them kind of differentiate them really. So I'm going to add just some purple, but using the thicker brush that we used earlier, this one here. So that way we can get a lot of coverage. Now I'm going to be a little bit generous with our purple, just kind of right in the middle there, just like that. And of course, just a touch of white. It's almost like a pinch of salt. It's like a recipe, isn't it? Pinch of salt, pinch of white, just like that. And still maintained that vibrancy in the color, and it doesn't get muddy. But look at how great that looks, right? So that's a good way to tell if your colors are cohesive, really, just to kind of bump them up against each other and see how it looks. That's a good amount of color. I don't have too much water on there. Good way to get rid of most of the water on the brush is just use the palette, right? Now, starting from the top down, right? Let's bring this down a little bit. There we go. I'm going to just paint from the top down, just like that. And you could see how opaque it just runs right along the edge like that. Nice and crisp, just right on top of it. And just thin out the brush, just lift it a little bit. Just lift it when you come across like that, right? And there's still a lot of color on there. Look at that, right? There's still quite a bit of color on there. It just hold and hold and hold. I love that about gouache. You want a clean edge, you want a feathered edge, you can use a feather brush too. It's a little bit tricky with gouache with using a feather brush because it's nice for oils, but the gouache dries pretty quickly. It probably dries the fastest out of all the wet mediums out of compared to watercolor and acrylic. So you can kind of feather the edge if you want, or you can have a nice polished, clean line like that, right? Whatever you wish. like that. Okay, now let's finish off the top of it so it looks great. Looking good so far. And just using the edge of the brush, just using the edge of it to create that nice line and that nice contour. It's very forgiving. So if you feel like you made a mistake, don't worry because you can just go over that with another layer of gouache and touch it up and polish it as well, right? So that's looking dandy. Look at this. Let's pause for a second and see what we got so far. And that's how I imagine it. It's looking great. See, the mountains in the back look like they're pushing back further back. If you want, you could even add some atmosphere, right? I feel like doing that because it's looking really good. I'm going to use the same brush and I'm going to leave these areas alone, let them just kind of dry, let them be happy. And using just a generous amount of white and a little bit more water, almost like a watercolor, I'm going to just put down some areas of color with a little bit more white on the brush. It's almost half dry brush on some and half wet because I'm just kind of mixing the white with the blue to create a nice kind of moody skyline. Right? Looking good. A little bit more white just to keep it really toned down. And you could add some pure white if you want. You could even go over some of the mountains to give a little bit of softness to it. And then you can kind of rub it out like that while it's still wet to give it some softness. Right? Don't be afraid to experiment, to just play with your brush and play with the marks, see what happens. And look at how moody that is. We add even more white right to the canvas, right to the paper. Now it's going to get even more moody. Check this out, see? Now we're adding highlights where the lights hit. You just keep to that nice guideline of working from dark to light or medium dark to light. You'll have a great time with gouache because it's such an easy way to paint. And I think it's also a great medium to take on location with you. You can do some really great landscapes. You don't have to worry about thinners or linseed oil, anything like that. You know, that's something you'd have to bring with a whole set of oils. It's also much more affordable than most paints. I'd say the probably more affordable, or as affordable as some cheaper acrylics, but quite versatile, right? Look at that sky, isn't that great? And that's just using the same blues that we painted the mountains with, right? So that's going to be our base layer for the background. That's going to make that nice, cool base layer. And as we come forward to the foreground, as we come forward in the picture plane, we're going to get warmer and warmer with the color. And that's really the trick of the eye because, you know, the warm colors will advance and the cool colors get pushed back. And that's how you give it that sense of dimensionality in space using only color. Isn't that neat? All right, so something we can do as well. I'm going to use some smaller brushes, right? I like using some of this color and bring it down here because most of the colors down here is going to be warmer, but I like to keep it nice and cohesive and nice and balanced. So I'm going to use some of the colors that we have used, some of these blues and purples, and this nice lilac, for example. We're going to bring that forward in some of the areas, maybe in the shadows, maybe in the water. We'll see, right? So just for the sake of variety, I'm going to use my round brush right? And maybe this nice thick brush. Let's see what happens with that brush. I don't know, it might be too thick. Let's see. Don't be afraid to just experiment. It's okay, right? I mean, it's all a work in progress. We're all just practicing, right? So I'm gonna bring down some of the colors that we used for those mountains and bring them down into the landscape here in the foreground. Just some touches here and there. Right? And for example, some of the water here, I might use with this pointed brush. There's some areas of land that just kind of string out to the side. Add a little bit of white to this purple. And maybe some of the darker areas here. And here's where we start to kind of block out some of the bigger areas with color. Still using color palette that we used earlier for the mountains, just to kind of bring it some balance, and maybe with a little bit more pure color or some of the darker areas. For example, this side here is just basically a cliff that drops straight down. So I'm going to use a straight pure blue, nice and rich. It just comes straight down into the water, right? And you can see how it's starting to look nice and balanced because we're bringing in some of the colors that we used in the background right here in the foreground. Now, most of this will be warmer. That's really the point of this, is to show you how simple it is to just work with those two ideas, just cool colors and warm colors in your painting, especially with gouache. Yeah. And let's start to paint. Add a little bit of sienna, warm it up a little bit. There we go. To this hill right here that's right in off to the side. And you can start to put in some of the values, some of the darker values that you're seeing in composition, right? Like this rock here. You can see we're just adding a little bit of sienna to create this nice shape. And then using the same color, we can start to see where some of the darker areas are in the background. For example, maybe the edge of the water meeting the mountains gets slightly darker, right? It's not a bad idea. And then some of the brushes and trees and landmass that surround some of the houses, for example. Just keep it nice and loose like that, because we're just working from big to small and dark to light. A little bit more purple to here. And some more blue. And make it nice and dramatic, right? And this edge here, it's really nice in contrast. It's got a heavy contrast to it, just right on the edge, like so. Right? And I don't want to go too much with uh, this blue. I think that's enough there. I might add a little bit to the side here, just to create some different values. We start to fill in the bigger areas of color, like we said. It's important. And start painting in the direction of where things are falling. The cliff just falls straight down. It comes in at an angle, for example. Right here on the edge is pretty dark. Good. And I wasn't sure about adding this rock right here in the foreground, but I think change my mind. I want to go ahead and add it. The only color that we've introduced now is sienna, a little bit of sienna to warm it up a little bit and start advancing the colors a tad. Some of the rocks here in the foreground. It's like that. All right. So now let's do something about this water. That's going to be this nice thick brush here, right? But don't worry about where you're at because it just develops more and more. And we really just add, this is really just our base layer of color. Some of the bigger areas of color, some of the bigger areas and tones of cool and warm that we're adding on for coverage, right? You don't have to cover the entire canvas or the entire piece of paper. Don't be afraid of the white showing. For now, we're just working on values in bigger areas of color, right? So got this nice thick brush for the water, right? Now, let's see what happens if we add a little bit of water. Now you can see how fast it dries, but it also softens up the edges where it's not as dry. And that's actually pretty cool because you can kind of pull the color off like that and create a nice atmosphere with the water, right? So just adding, it's almost like you're reactivating it just a little bit to give it some softness, to give it some value, and also create some movement in the water. In some of the areas here where it's closer to us, it's going to be a lot warmer. You can add some more aggressive marks to really push it forward, to really make it pop. Okay, great. And I like some of the blues that we've applied here. So I'm just going to add just in touches here, right? Because my plan is to give it some movement, really, just to give it some movement. And then drying the brush or wetting the brush, cleaning it. So you get most of the color off. And while it's still a little bit wet, I have a little bit of water on the brush, not too much. Just pull that color, kind of soften it up. Not all of it, but just some of it, some touches of it, right? Just like that. Now it looks like it's alive. The whole seascape looks like it's alive. Very nice. Mhm. So just by working with these layers, got a little bit of water on the brush, so I'm going to use it to kind of activate some of these colors around the village here, the town, in the center. Create a little bit of atmosphere with that. There we go. Great. Looking good so far. So let's pause for a second, take a look. It's always good to pause in your drawing, your painting, and just see where you're at, and it gives you an idea where you want to go from there. So looking good so far. Now I think we need to create some base layer painting, some colors, base layer colors for the town here in the center, and then we're off and running because now we can start to fill in some of the bigger areas of detail, right? So far, so good. And if you take your time a little bit and go at a slower pace, don't worry, because you can go your own pace. You can watch the video over and over and catch up. I tend to paint a little bit quicker, but go your own pace. The pace that you paint at and you draw at, that's the correct pace to go. All right, so I'm going to bring back some of the smaller brushes that we have and maybe bring in a small round brush for detail and the square brush here. That's going to help us. Maybe even this smaller square brush. That's going to come in pretty handy, right? It doesn't have much bristles on it. It's not that long, but I think it'll be good to paint some of the houses. All right, so you don't have to use the exact same colors that you see. You can use whatever colors whatever colors you want to imagine, whatever colors you want to create and make it more creative and imaginative. So I'm going to drop in a little bit more orange, some yellows, maybe some yellow ochre, and of course some red and orange. Like I said, the orange and yellow, it's going to create a nice warm palette for us. But for now, I think would be great to add some warmer colors right in here to give it some focus. So let's do that. Right. So let's create first a nice warm green, just using some yellow there and some of the blue that we used. You can go right from this area here where we used it for the mountains. And I want to kind of tone down green because I want it to be in the background. Don't want it to be too electric or too vibrant. That's a great green right there. It's actually still slightly warm, not too much, so we can use that for some of the grassy areas around the village. And you'll notice, like I said earlier, because it's so opaque, you don't have to worry about any kind of mistake about painting it over an area, over a drawing, or some areas that you've sketched out, because you can just paint right over it and add the detail that you want. And you can kind of vary the green too. You can add some dark greens and light greens, for example. Just some different spots here. You kind of mix on the go while you're adding it because you can make your adjustments along the way. By just adding a little bit of blue or ultramarine blue or anything darker that you want to add. Just lighten it up a little bit. A great way to lighten the color. Believe it or not, it's actually better. You saw it earlier when we're adding some of the blue base layer color is rather than using white, straight white, pure white, you just add a little bit of the contrast or complementary color. So in this case, I'm adding a little bit of yellow to the green instead of white to just shift the value of it and tone of it, but maintain its vibrancy, but also lighten it as well. So just in some of the spots here where you see some green, and this is a good example. Look at how it just sits right on top of that mountain that we drew, the hill here, right? That's a good example. Some of the spots underneath here, these will be much warmer, but I like to kind of have the colors vibrate together and kind of react to one another. Okay, that's all the green I want to add for that, right? But I do love this dark green that I made with it. So if you make a color that you like, you really appreciate it, go with it. Just, go ahead and add it to some areas because I think that's a nice green there. So I'm gonna go ahead and add it to this foreground here because it's nice and strong. It's got some different rocks, different patterns of rocks. I think it'd be interesting to make with some different colors. Okay, here we go. Far so good. Okay, so now just shifting, letting that green just kind of relax and dry a little bit. Now I'm going to shift to the warm so far, maybe a yellow ochre and some of these red and oranges that you see here on the palette, kind of mixing those together. All right, so I'm going to use a smaller brush and still keeping with these two smaller brushes, the flat brush here and the round brush here. Right. So the layers advance pretty quickly. So technically we're still kind of in our base layer, but we are starting to flesh out some of the details with the painting. It's looking really nice. So I'm going to mix just a nice variety of warmer colors here. Won't go too crazy because we want to maintain a nice balance in the painting. And you already have some of these other colors complemented. It's not a bad idea to use them as well. I'm cleaning the brush in between while I'm mixing some colors. Let's make a nice orange, for example. Got this pure orange here, but I'm going to soften it up with some yellow. Right, so now we have three different tones of orange and yellow. And we have a pure, kind of a pure orange right there, and we have a light and medium orange right there. Right? Now let's mix some of the red in there. I think that'd be neat. Let's create a couple different tones of that. So we have some red here, add a little bit of sienna to the red. And that's going to make a nice dark tone. If you want to add some ultramarine, I know it's a cool color, but look what happens when we do that. Pulling from that same color, we get three different values of color just using that red. So that's pretty neat. Okay, so now we're going to get really moving. Lots of things happening here because we're starting to get to some bigger areas of color. And I'm just going to go right for it because we have these really warm values that are anxious. They're excited to get to be a part of the painting. You're still using this single brush to keep me focused on light values and texture, just the simpler things really, so I won't get too obsessed about not much detail. That's going to come last. Okay, let's use some of the red that we had for some of the rocks here. That'd be really cool. And then of course we have the red of some of the houses. We can do that. You could see just even if it goes a little bit more than you want it to, if it gets a little heavy, you can make those corrections. It's no big deal. That's what's great about using gouache. Right? Let's use a little bit of the orange in there. Create some different colors in here. Right? And just some touches in the background. Some of the houses here. There's a few, there's one that's right in the center. It's really nice orange. Right. There's a few highlights of some of the smaller houses off in the distance. They're probably the same size as some of these houses are here in the foreground, but they look pretty far back. So let's just give it a little bit of spot of color, just so we give it a hint of where they are. All right. That's looking good. All right, so now I want to go back to this wider brush to finish out some of these areas here of landmass that we haven't painted yet. I'm going to use the ochre, and that's a nice warmer color. So I'm going to go ahead and just put that down, a little bit less color. Just kind of trail it off. And that's going to really advance. You can see it's going to really advance the composition forward. And you can kind of add in a few bits of green if you want to tone it down, just to vary the color, for example. And go right back to the pure color. And just go for covering the big areas of white, most of it, if you want. You don't have to cover all of it, but just quite a bit of it so that we have a lot of coverage now. There we go. And this little bit of water on my brush, so I'm going to dry it off. That way I get a more pure color for some of these rocks here. And this is where we start to start to move towards our second layer. And we start to move towards detailing now. Right, we can use some of the yellow and a little bit of white to it. Look at all those different textures that we're seeing. Isn't that nice? And you could see that base layer of blue, just a touch of it, still coming through. And some of the texture here of the rocks, for example. It's interesting. And you can just get really creative with this part. Just play around with it and see what kind of details you can add when you start to layer those colors, when you go from dark to light and from cool to warm, for example. Okay. So I'm gonna finish off with painting over almost all the white by covering the rooftops. So let's do that. Just a nice darker color for most of them, and get rid of most of the water on the palette. And I'm just gonna go ahead and paint some of the rooftops that we see there. Just nice simple shapes, really. There we go. And you'll see in a little bit, because we're reaching towards the finish here, or at least we're at a good spot to finish this, to continue on another day, but also want to show you how and why I'm saving the last bit of detail, especially when it comes to highlights. You want to save that for last, because you can see now how opaque it really is, how opaque gouache really is. Let's use a more pure orange here for this one. Maybe some red to give it a nice warmer color for the rooftop. And the brush already has quite a bit of water on it, so I'm not adding any more to it. Just some smaller areas of triangles of rooftops that I'm seeing, and squares, the front of some of the houses, for example. Okay, just some spots here and there. That's the great thing about this stage now, is in the painting, is working from dark to light and working in these different color temperature values. It's good that we're waiting for each layer. So that's kind of why I move around. I'm waiting for any layer that I apply to properly dry, so there isn't any kind of unwanted color mixing happening before I paint on top of that, right? So let's keep it going. And I really love this dark kind of royal blue that we made with the ultramarine and the purple. So I'm going to add just a little bit of red to that to keep it nice and dark, right? Just like that, to bring out some of the dark contrast areas in our painting. For example, right on the edge of the water and right underneath some of the houses, for example, right? There's some areas that are really dark and are shaded. So I'm gonna use some of that color to bring that out. And when you start to detail it, you can go it's not just the highlights, not just the light areas. You can add in a few flourishes of the darker tones that you see or silhouettes that you see. That's really going to bring out the painting. Okay, so right here in between, there's some areas that are pretty dark. Just right along the edge of the water. That's going to bring out some of that detail of the edge of the water and bring out some of that contrast that we want. When I get to this stage of the painting, I always realize there's so much more I can do to detail it if I wanted to. And the key is really that's about your intuition, right? So it becomes more intuitive the more you paint and you start to accept whatever your comfort level is, whatever your preferences are, uh, with how far you want to detail things. I like to keep things nice and loose and kind of playful. So I might not go too far with details. But if I do have more time, if I'm on location, for example, I mean, if I have less time and I'm on location, for example, I'll just try to capture what I can and just get the essence of a place. And sometimes you don't have a lot of time to capture it, but you may do. And it's good to practice that actually while you're in the studio so you know what to do when you are on location. Very good. All right, and just keep running that along. Have a little bit of less water on the brush and adding some warm highlights to it, some warmer colors to it to keep it nice and rich and really advance some of the colors that we're seeing here. Mixing the sienna with the red and orange. And as I go further back, I'll probably use less and less of those colors. Less and less of the warmer colors. Just using the edge of the brush. Just kind of running it along the edge here of the cliffs. And here you'll see I'm going to start to use more blue as I get further and further away. Like that. Okay, very nice. And I like how dark this is as we get into the fur. It's very moody, so I do want to incorporate that. I'll show you how to do that. I'm going to take this nice big thick brush, which doesn't have much water in it, and kind of sitting there quietly waiting. And I'm just going to make sure that's light and just give it a little bit of texture in the water here. Give it some movement, right? Adding a little bit of red and warm it up and give it some movement. So And here's where you can just start to use some pure color to really bring out some of those warmer temperatures in the color, warmer values. You start to play around with texture, bringing it back up to the colors up here in the landmass. There we go. Not nice? So you can just do things like that along the way to just really make it more dynamic and really liven up the picture. So let's see, we have a little bit of time. You can go really full detailed here. So what I do want to do is create some textures for some of the rocks that we have, like the mountains and some of the cliff sides that we have here to create some different color values. So all we have to do is just create lighter versions of these colors here to do that. It's really easy. So let's maybe take a round brush and a bigger flat brush, like these two work pretty good, right? And maybe even when it's thicker, will do. And let's mix that purple. Because all we really did was add just some white to it, right? Just like that. And I'm gonna just be generous with the white, and you could see there's already a different value. You could see the difference between this mountain here and this color here. So we can use that white to create some highlights. For example, this runs straight down, so we have some almost looks like a cliff that runs straight down, like so. And we can dry the brush a little bit more if you want, and just use it for some of the highlights to bring out some of the character of that mountain, right? So I'm going to add a little bit white. We don't want it to get too dark or too warm. And just from the top down, you could see some of the highlights that kind of pull down that the light catches on some of these ridges, for example. Just like that. As we get further and further back, obviously it gets softer and softer, so you don't want to highlight that too much. But I love how that looks. That's great, right? And just some other touches here and there. We can use the same color to balance it out. We can kind of use the same color to bring out some of these rocks here, for example. That's not a bad idea. And look what happens when we do that, right? Look at how much that advances. And that's, just elevating the painting now is just really coming ahead, coming full head steam and really coming together. Let me settle with this color. I don't want to go overboard with it. But, you could see how forgiving the medium is because you can really just play around with layers and layers of this color. And it really starts to come together. I love this color. So I'm going to add a little bit to these rocks here. Maybe even use a smaller brush, more detailed brush to just dab this color a little bit here and there to bring out some of those highlights in the rocks. And you can see where it's elevating really eventually to the last stage when you start to put in some of the key areas of highlight colors, whether they be the darkest blacks that you would see in real life or the darkest tones that you would see and the lightest lights, the highlights essentially. Sometimes when I do this, I'll have two different brushes just to create different textures, for example. Right? And I do want to, so I'll leave that alone. If I feel like I'm really working some coverage and applying a lot of paint, I'll slow down a bit. I'll slow it down a bit just to uh, let it breathe and let it relax. Let me zoom in a little bit here so you guys can see better detail and maybe tone down camera light. There we go. Isn't that nice? Look at the atmosphere. It's looking really great, really coming together. I do want to soften this up a tad. It's a lot darker the in real life. There we go. Make an adjustment on my light so you guys can see the tone a little better. It's a little bit darker here in tone. There we go. That's looking better. Great. Right. So I want to soften this up, and a great way to do that, a couple different ways. And don't let this stress you out. You can just add a little bit of water to your freshly clean brush and take a blue, nice soft blue, right? So that's a pretty good tone. It's not too heavy right there, right? And just kind of dry it. Take most of the water out of the brush. And this is a good test. You can see it's not much there. It's kind of splitting. And just in some areas where you want to soften it, just run it along like so, right? Just to kind of soften up those areas in the background, right? It gives it a little bit of mood. It softens up, pushes back the different layers of mountains that we painted. And it also amplifies the movement of the sky, the clouds. Okay, good. Don't want to go too heavy with it, but that feels really nice. See, isn't that great? So there's already a lot of movement in it. And if you want, since we're there, some of the same color, I'm gonna use the rest of what's on the palette just to keep that movement going. You have some warmer colors here that are still a little bit active. And you can use that to kind of flow it into the water, for example. Right. And then you can use the same thing to just kind of soften up everything overall if you want to give it a little bit more atmosphere. So we're on our way to something really nice happening and something really special. It's really coming together. I mean, this is a great composition and a great painting really for on location. If we're just painting on the spot, we want to take an hour to capture a scene. You can see how working from cool to warm, how much it really advances the picture plane in the way that you want. So I'm saving this part for last because we have some of the highlights that we want to add in. There's a lot more we can do if we wanted, if you wanted to create more textures and more shapes and more marks. I think the mountains are done, the clouds are done. I think it looks great. And I think this is on its way as well. I probably will touch this up a little bit more and create a lot more texture and really define the edges a little bit more. But I do want to save this for last, just so we do have enough time. I want to show you with our thin brush, our detail brush. Let's see, this one's probably the thinnest one of all of them. So we're just using straight white, right? Just pure white if you want. And I mean, you can use a nice, vibrant, warm color. You can use a yellow, for example, because it is very opaque. Let's see, the white's kind of dried out on me here. So let's add a little bit more on the palette. There we go. Now we can play around with that white. And I already have all the darks on here, so I don't have to worry about that. So we have this white here, just kind of a balance of maybe 50%. Don't want it too watery because we're going to be using this almost like we're drawing the detail in and getting rid of most of the water that's on there and just using the tip of it for that finer line work. Right, so starting from this side here, I'm just going to draw in just like that. Maybe some of the windows, for example, and some of the legs or stilts of the house. Isn't that cool? And just a little bit of detail. You can use a smaller brush. This brush is probably a little too thick, but that's okay. It's keeping me honest. And just create some of the detail like that. I kind of like that I'm using a bigger brush. It's preventing me from, it's keeping the painting and the marks nice and loose. But you can use a smaller brush. Nothing wrong with that. For more detail, you can get more exact with it. But I love how playful it looks for now and how nice and loose it feels. And as I come forward, I can get more precise if I wanted some of the details there. Right. And this one here, let's case it out. Let's go ahead and give it a rooftop like that. And then some windows here. There's two windows. And then the stilts are longer because it's closer to us, closer to the foreground. And then some of the houses in the back are actually white. So I'm going to go ahead and paint some of those houses there in the background just to give it some vibrancy, even though some of the areas there we dropped out, but also to polish it up a little bit, clean it up a little bit. Some of the fronts of these houses are white. You can barely see it. They're just a hint of them, right? They're just a little bit of color, just touches of color here and there. Not too much. And this is the fun part with detailing, right? I mean, you can really go overboard with the amount of detail you want to add. It's up to you. But you can see how really saving it for the last bit down the stretch, why it's okay to do that, especially with this medium with gouache. I think it's the best for that is when you get to the detailing of it. Right, and you can add in the road, for example, some areas like that you kind of draw in those areas to give it a little bit of the atmosphere. Right? And some areas, not too much. Remember, it's as we go further and further back into the distance, I'm going to add a little bit more water to finish out some of the detail work for the conclusion of our awesome gouache painting class. I'm going to add in some of those highlights in the background with a little bit more water to soften it up, tad, right? If you pick up a little bit of, of it with a different brush, you can soften it up quite a bit. No worries there. And you see how it gives it that nice kind of sheen, and I'm not going to do too much to that because as it's off in the distance, it gets softer and softer and less focused. And just a few areas here as well to give it just some highlights of color where the light might be peering through the clouds and just gives us just a little bit of that color shining through. And just kind of soften it up like so. All right. So let's take a look at what we have. This is I'm really happy with how it turned out. Obviously, there's a lot more we can do. I mean, that's what's great about painting is it's really up to you and what you're comfortable with and how much fun you're having. I'm having so much fun doing this. I have a feeling I'm going to touch this a little bit more. So a good idea with any kind of painting, with gouache or acrylic or oil and watercolor, is if you're not sure, I know that I want to add a little bit more detail to this foreground and just a few more touches of paint. If you're not sure though, I would say let it be, let it sit and let it breathe and relax and give it a few minutes, give it an hour, or better yet, tackle it the next day, see what happens. Because sometimes you might change your mind and think, this is just right. It just feels just right. And that's a good idea to know exactly when or if your painting is finished, right? So recapping from the beginning, and we can add a little bit more. Actually, let's do that because we do have a little bit of time. So just since I've been meaning to detail some of this foreground, before I do a little bit of a recap, I'm going to use just the small brush here, the detail brush that we've been using, and some of those areas of highlights that we're going to add in the foreground, just right here, right, to really clarify it, to really define it a little bit more. And I'm going to use my detail brush and some of the warmer colors that we have here. Literally went from cool to warm as we went from the top down. That's kind of mimicked exactly what happened in the painting in our palette. So that's interesting. Right? So I'm gonna I'm gonna add some white to some of these really bright areas of color that we have. And just use it to create some highlights. Really beautiful highlights. And it goes both ways. If you want to go back into these areas and touch it up with some contrast, some darker tones, some darker colors, you can certainly do that. That's not a bad idea. For example, let's do that. Let's paint in some of the areas here that are right along the bottom that has a nice dark tone to it that will give us some definition. In this seascape, this wonderful seascape that we painted. Right? And really that's just a warm version of that blue that we're using. That's it. We're just adding some warm colors to it. And finishing off the last bit of detail to give us the edge of these beautiful rocks. Just to really define the edges of them and crevices and cracks and all of the different textures that we're seeing, right? Just right off the page there like that. And just like that. And I want to do this last mark here just in the foreground because that is the closest to us. So I'm going to use the same color to advance to create some shapes here with it. Same thing here with this rock here. And just underneath, just in some areas here, not everywhere, maybe on the backside, for example, where the light isn't quite hitting it, and where it meets the water, quite often where the rock meets the water, it gets dark right along the line, right along the surface, just underneath, because the light is just not hitting it. Sunlight isn't. Just like that. There we go. All right. So, and it just, it just gets more and more and more interesting as we move further and further in to just, this being more, adding more texture, adding more brushwork and more vibrancy and energy to the drawing, to the painting. Let's lift this up so you can see the entire composition here. And that's, it's looking good. It's actually quite larger, like taller than you're seeing there. And let me move this down so you can see more of the composition. There we go. Right. And that's looking great. So just to recap, we are towards the end of our class. I love how this looks. We started with a really great sketch, really helps to have really good sketch, really just composed before you paint. And we started painting our base layers first, keeping in mind we're blocking in the larger areas of color like we did throughout the painting here in some of the mountains, for example, and moving on to the finer details as we could elevate more and more towards adding some of the textures and some of the marks that we want to include. So that shows you how important that base layer is with gouache and how important it is to work with considering cool colors and warm colors and how they really advance the picture plane. And also working from dark to light because it's so opaque. It's such a great medium to work with in that order. It's kind of the reverse of watercolor where you work from light to dark really, but much slower. And with watercolor, you have more glazes. So here you can begin with the darkest colors and apply the lighter colors over the top. All right, so just let me just switch here to this camera here. All right, so thank you for joining us today in our DXLive class with me, Jedidiah Dore. I hope you had a great time painting. I hope you keep going with this painting. I know what I'm going to do for the rest of the day. I'm going to continue with this painting and finish it out. I really love it, how it turned out. So I hope you have a great time experimenting with gouache. I hope I showed you how wonderful it really is for painting some incredible landscapes. Have fun, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me.